Hey everyone, I'm so glad to be on this podcast with Cooper. And Cooper and I talk a lot about relationships and how to heal relationships. We work together with a few of our clients. And so I have a North Star question just to start out our talk today, Cooper. And that is, why is self-love and how is self-love really essential to having good, healthy relationships with other people?
Hi, Susan. Thank you. So I feel like our individual quest is, and the most important relationship is the relationship with ourselves. The way we've grown up, so we grew up with parents that were less conscious than us, their parents were less conscious than them, and we were taught and programmed that self-love is being self-centered, or selfish. I actually like the term self-centered because it's bringing yourself into your center. And so we're kind of undoing old programming that didn't work. It's like, it's a weird analogy, but it's like they used to think that punishing dogs was the way to, and kids, was the way to teach them. And it's just an old-fashioned view. And they had an old-fashioned view that to love yourself is selfish, and actually it's self-honoring. Mm-hmm. And our quest, everyone I've worked with, from billionaires through to people who need scholarships, is everyone feels unworthy of something. Mm-hmm. And so it's really digging in and finding out, where are my places that I don't feel whole, so that I can work them curiously. Mm-hmm. Because it's self-judgment is what causes lack of self-love. All judgment does. When we're judging others, when we're gossiping about others, when we're talking, it's always outward. Mm-hmm. And our job is to turn the lens inward.
Mm-hmm. And so I have a few thoughts for you from what you just said. But first, I just thought maybe you could let people know what your background is in terms of how you work with people, because I know you and I work together a lot in different formats, and I just want to make sure that people understand how you work and how you see things.
So the way I would describe it is I'm very much into people dynamics, what causes people to be the way they are. And so we're like working with couples, for example, I say, I'm not interested in your fight. I'm interested in what's beneath your fight. And within that, I'm interested in where the patterns are that cause similar fights. And then beneath that, so it's always trying to curiously dig below and actually make a game of it, to find out what's the limiting belief that's fueled that situation. And sometimes it's just an assumption someone's made. So my background is I'm Australian. I studied, I was a software entrepreneur, and then was a natural leader, was CEO and natural leader. And I just was always fascinated with how people work. And then I went and studied spiritual psychology, NLP, hypnosis, timeline therapy, all of these things. And I continue to, I just have a thirst for understanding. I like to say, I know that what I know so far is the tip of my fingernail, and which makes it exciting. And I noticed this pattern of people feeling unworthy about something, and finding the dark corners that they themselves don't even know of sometimes. Mm-hmm. So that they, because our quest is, our own self-sovereignty is to love ourselves unconditionally. And it's strange, most people don't realize this, but love by its very nature cannot be conditioned. It's conditioned by us. Mm-hmm. We're the ones who try to put boundaries and conditions on it, but it's really by its very nature not conditional. And so as long as people are curious, I feel like they can find where the things are within themselves. And most often and you see this all the time, is in relationships, they always want to say it's the other person causing. I can't be happy because of you. I can't be this because of you. You did that, this happened, and when we turn outward, we're making ourselves the victim. When we're always blaming, we're making ourselves the victim, and the victim is never in charge. Yeah, so the way I like to work with people that are willing to be curious and willing to work on themselves. And if they just want a rah-rah person to say, hey, just tell me I'm right and the other person's wrong, then I'm not the best person.
Yeah.
But helping people feel safe is so important. That they can feel safe being who they are and expressing themselves, because usually is in couple situations, as you know, often one won't speak up.
Right. So getting back to the concept of self-love, and that being the basis of like all essential to all healthy relationships, I like that word that you talked about, which was like self-centered, like really making sure that you center yourself so that you know where you're coming from. And it made me think about when this whole thought about the way that people are raised, and that maybe the way that we were raised earlier on in life is like more disciplined. So it's, instead of being like loving and compassionate towards oneself, you're more disciplined and harder, and you better get this done, and so there is no like way to find the center. In a way, you're just kind of being almost authoritative with yourself. You know what I mean? And I find like in different relationships where people try to heal themselves, and I think a lot of times we go into couple relationships to heal ourselves with that person, or to heal some of our own things that weren't met for us and our parents. I was thinking that when I work with parents, that I see that they're also trying to do the same thing. They're trying to like heal themselves in these relationships with their kids, where they actually get to nurture their kids maybe the way they weren't nurtured, so sort of talking about this generational pattern that everyone tries to improve a little bit more along the hierarchy of how they're growing in the lineage, right? But what do you think some of the essential things that people should have in their minds or in their own self-practices about self-love, or trying to develop that concept in themselves?
Yes. I find that people, I'll tell you my own journey of self-love. So I grew up really shy, and if you couldn't talk to me about surfing, I grew up in Australia, and I didn't really have much to talk to you about, and my insecurity was so deep, which is so strange because I don't have it anymore. And really just leaning into situations and a lot of self-practice, meditation, things that slowing down. You asked about centering. When we're in our center, we're able to be responsive, not reactive. And especially in the US, I found there's just a lot of self-loathing, that people quietly have it, and they don't know how to deal with it, and so it ends up coming out in a form of a projection. Because when it's too painful, we deflect, and our goal is to reflect. Right? So deflect is you put it back out. Reflect is you curiously look inside. And so and unfortunately, when you're putting it out, you're usually not doing it curiously, because you're doing it to avoid the pain.
Yeah, and that's why oftentimes I think it's really hard to be in relationship with someone. Like if you're having really low self-esteem, or someone else's, it's really hard to be in relationship with someone like that, or if you're like that, because there's a lot of like needs, like almost unmet needs in the relationship already.
Yeah. I'm really glad you said that, because I want that loops back to something you said earlier, and that is it's just a reality we attract in. It's a reality that we're learning more about. It's quantum field, and the law of attraction works with the law of vibration. And like attracts like. And so we've come in, our souls have plans, right? And we've come in to learn our lessons. So when we find a partner, we find a partner that's going to help us heal what's not healed. And I can't explain how that all works. I just know that it works. And so we attract in those that are going to help us learn our lessons. And Earth is, essentially it's a celestial Earth school. So we come here to learn. And when we're not present, when we're living too far into the past or too far into the future, we're not able to really get in and understand the dynamics. And not many, we didn't grow up in a world where we went to school and they taught us about emotions. Emotions are more important than many of the things we learn about in school.
Right. Well, I want to bring it back to sort of psychological speak, because I know some people that will be listening to this are clients that I work with, and I sort of educate them about sort of psychological terms. So if we looked at what you said in the spiritual realm, sort of in the psychological realm, that, that whole thing that when you're attracted to someone, there's usually, we bond in the positive and the negative bond, and that's how we find the bond to be complete, right? So there's like the part of, oh, we love that part of that person, it's so amazing. But then there's also, we're bonding with the shadow side of that person too. And that's sort of what feels familiar. So it might also be that that's also very challenging. So if that person, let's say, is more of a free spirit and you're more of a disciplined person, that's like such a, ease, like to be with someone that's not like you. And then it's also something that you have to constantly negotiate or start negotiating so that there isn't all this projection. But in order to do that, you have to have some kind of relationship with yourself that you can kind of figure out, okay, what's me, what's them? And do I really have a strong sense of myself? So I always know where I start and end, and the other person starts and ends, right? So I can break the pattern, because otherwise you get engulfed in these patterns. But when you were talking about the whole idea about past, present and future, we were talking about this in the prep conversation that we had, which was the infinity sign, right? And I'll make sure that that's drawn in the in some part of this conversation, a link at the below or something. But we talked about, like, to really distinguish where you are whenever you're engaging with someone. Are you in your past? Are you in your trauma past? Are you really just right here with them, or in your future tripping, where you're not, again, like there's pressures on either side of that infinity sign, right?
Yeah. So the crisscross of the infinity is here. So one side is your past, the other side is your future. The center is now, and everyone on the planet, the time right now is now.
Right.
And so we're just still learning a lot about that. When we're in our past, our past rises up from our subconscious, and that we tend to operate from that place. And when we're in the now, we can be more open, we can be more curious, because whether it's with yourself or with another, relationships are critical. It's really hard to get by on this planet without being able to have relationships you can depend on, and instead, if you can't depend on your relationship with yourself, it's challenging. It begins with challenging, and it's really just, I say just, but it's not easy. It's actually a lifetime's worth of work. I mean, I would love to tell you I'm perfect at it, but I'm not. And I don't think anyone is. And I just feel like that the more we judge ourselves so quickly, right? And we judge so quickly, and every time we judge, we're separating ourselves from our center.
So the practices of, like, getting back in connection with yourself when you're in judgment, getting back into your own compassion or empathy towards yourself, and like self-nurturing as a way to replenish and build reserve. So you can have something to give when you're in relationships, but also not only give, but to receive, right? Because it takes energy
Right.
to receive, to be open to receive back.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so the bulk of what we are unhappy about from ourselves either happened through our family or through our childhood circumstances. And the version of, say, Cooper that created these limiting or irrational beliefs when I was little was emotionally capable of working it. So when we talk about working the past, we're really talking about going back and to a previous now. It's just a previous now, and working the energy that's being held in the emotional body.
Right.
And that energy shows up when it gets triggered.
Right. So we talked about this yesterday, and I'm going to pull in something that you just said with the whole idea of getting triggered. Like if you're triggered in relationships or in your relationship, part of what you're doing is attracting some of the things you have to work out. So your energy's in that, like in that trigger. Like you've actually created the trigger in that thing. That other person's just supplied the great landscape of a place where you get to practice. Are you going to work on that trigger, work out that trigger?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then as long as you want them to be the blame, you'll never get the answers.
Right. So that's the activeness about the trigger, because the trigger isn't like, oh, they're just doing this thing that's triggering me. Like you own the trigger. And
Yeah.
once you've done the work on the trigger, you won't have that trigger anymore. Although triggers can definitely cycle up, like in weak moments when you haven't done a lot of your own self-care practices and you don't have any reserve and you are feeling judgmental of yourself, they can bubble up, the triggers.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And because of their very nature, you have to be really curious with them.
Mhm. So can you describe some of your self-care practices that help you replenish self-love?
Yeah. I do a lot of self-nurturing, whether it's just like walks or baths or meditation, um, things that are self-honoring. And then said people underestimate the power of curiosity. Um, just really being curious when if anything upsets my heart, I'm the only one I like to describe. We've all got a dimmer switch on our light in our heart, and we think another person can turn that dimmer switch, but it's how we're reacting to a circumstance that only we have a hand on the dial. And so just being very aware of when the peace in your heart gets disturbed, what's your part of the disturbance? As you just said, the other party might set the landscape, but it was something, and it's always something old. And hence, so I shared with you the other day the concept of this house of joy, self-empathy. So when you go back to inquire where it's from, you start with empathy, self-empathy, because you're looking at a little version of you, or at least an older version of you, even if it was only a month old, and you said something you regret, right? And you can then look and say, okay, where did that come from me? Why was that so fueled? It was fueled because there was something unresolved.
Right.
And the way to work the unresolved is to go back and be curious with the earlier version of you. And it's not to discount that something may have happened that felt offensive, but I like to use an analogy of a backpack. So you have a backpack full of rocks and these rocks were old events. And then a new event happens and it goes in, all of a sudden the backpack gets so heavy, right? But you're responding to the whole backpack because it's never been dealt with, as opposed to the new rock. And if the backpack is dealt with, then the new rock won't feel as significant. And so the significant. One can stay more centered because, hey, that's a rock I didn't want, but at least it's a new rock, and it's a lot easier to work with once you've cleared the initial backpack.
Right. So you've cleared the heaviness, sort of going with that analogy, you've cleared the heaviness. So anything new that comes on that's a challenge, you've cleared like what would you call it? What's the word for it? It's like the baggage that comes with it, like the emotional baggage, the drain of it.
Yeah, it's all emotional baggage that's held in the emotional body, which is still not well understood by science.
Right.
It's becoming. I do a lot of shamanic work, as you know, and it's all energy. At the end of the day, it's all energy, and where are we retaining those old stories? And they show up like that.
Right.
And the more we can catch when it's showing up before it shows up, the more we have a chance to deal with it before it shows up.
Right.
And so getting back to the working it, so you got the self-empathy can then lead to the next pillar, which is self-compassion, which can lead to self-forgiveness. We don't forgive ourselves enough. And which can lead to self-loving kindness, which is the last column. The bottom of the house, the foundation of the house, is gratitude. And I can draw this for you and send it to you.
Yes. I mean, I think that is there is a point in that, is the self-forgiveness. And a lot of times when people, because, we work with a lot of couples, right, in different ways. And a lot of people, when they're in relationships and they're having a hard time moving on, it is that self-forgiveness piece that I think gets missed, because a lot of times it's like, oh, I'm so upset that I invested so much in this person that wasn't the right person for me, or we struggled so much. And part of that is the forgiveness piece of like, can you forgive yourself for like allowing yourself to be neglected, or allowing yourself to be in conflict so much? Like, can you forgive yourself for that?
Yeah.
And I think one of the most powerful things is really getting, especially with the energy work, is getting used to referencing your body for information. So I know for myself, like a lot of times when I'm making a decision or something doesn't feel right for me, I check in with my body first, like, okay, is this the right decision? And usually my body will tell me. And if it can't, it's because I'm not centered enough to hear it, to listen to it. But usually I'm like, oh, that just doesn't feel right. Whether it's the kind of, I always think about boundaries with people, and boundaries is just like that agreement that you have with certain people in your life, like agreements that you have with your clients, with your friends, with your family, with your intimate partners. Like there's certain agreements that you have to feel are right for you, right? In terms of how you're going to interact with other people.
Yeah. People don't really interact much with themselves in terms of really stopping and curiously looking and saying, often people feel like therapy is a have to, not a get to. It's actually a get to. I get to do this. I get to learn about the dynamics of myself and my beloved. But it applies to all relationships. How we show up in a relationship is how we're showing up for ourselves.
Yeah, and we talked about this too, which I think is a really good concept. And you said one of the things that you do is keeping your word to yourself.
Like, keeping a word period is is so important, because for your partner to feel safe, they have to feel safe that what you're saying is the truth.
Right.
And if once they question that, then that's difficult. And if you, to yourself, if you're in denial, an old teacher of mine used to wear a T-shirt, and he said, "Denial's not a river in Africa." If you're in denial, you're going to stay in denial. You can't be curious and be in denial.
Right. And I think if you're not keeping your commitments to yourself, which should be the easiest ones to keep, like I'm going to take care of myself, I'm going to look after myself, I'm going to let myself have space and time to be able to be myself more when I'm with other people. If you can't do those kinds of practices for yourself, it's going to be really hard to do that next level of engagement with another person.
Yeah, yeah. And once again, it's the infinity. If it's out of balance on one side, it's out of balance. And so often in relationships, it's out of balance because one ends up kind of being submissive um, and compromising where they don't want to. As you said earlier, that they haven't defined the boundaries. They haven't woken up their throat chakra and are able to feel safe saying what they really need.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true for ourselves too. Because we grew up in a world where we were told to be quiet. Children were often told speak when spoken to,
Mm-hmm.
and so we're just unraveling all these old paradigms that didn't work as we understand more of the dynamics of what is now clearly a quantum field. And every time we lock a possibility, we eliminate every other possibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
so if someone was going to go about like just trying to start having a self-love practice, like just they were new to the concept, like they were new to their own self-exploration, where would you guide them to start?
Yeah, I would guide them start with a gratitude list of all the things I'm grateful for about myself.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'd make a list of all the things I wish I could change about myself. And I would start to explore those lists. And then in exploring the ones that I don't like about myself, is this true? A lot of people spend a lot of time outwardly wanting to please others. Right? They're concerned about what other people think of them, right? And overly concerned, and so they give a lot of their self-worth away trying to appease others based on
Right.
what they assume others are going to think.
Right. So going back to the psychological explanation, so like exploring the list to see what's true and identifying like, oh, this is just a story I tell myself about how other people might think about me. Like, is this just a story or is it really true? Something that really bothers me about myself, or something that I want to change about myself,
And how
or
would I change
the
it?
shadow part of myself that I need to accept and love. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If it's something you can't change, then it's something to accept. If it's something you can change, then you explore what would it take to change it, and why am I wanting to change it. There's another way you could do it as well, and that is I like to use Jack and Jill for the names of the couples. Right? So Jack makes a list of. You can invite Jill or anyone else to contribute, and then creates a new, and they both get to contribute. And the old, you leave all the things on the old that you don't want in the new, and then you start to map. How do I get from old to new?
So you glitched there for a second. So part of it is writing a list of whatever it is that you want to change, and then showing it to Jill and saying like,
so you're making the list called the old Jack first.
Okay.
And you may make it on your own, or you may make it together. It's an exercise you can do together. And so Jill will get to contribute to things about old Jack that some of them may be things that Jack's not aware of, right? Like,
right.
And they don't necessarily need to be negative. It could be, I really like how kind you are to people. And he may
keep that on the list.
So that we're going to transfer from old to new, right? So
right.
What do we want to maintain from the old list, and then have on the new list for Jack, and then you do the same for Jill, right? And they can do them individually and then come together too.
Right.
Depending on how
but
safe
it's so different. It's so different to approach it this way, right? This whole idea about exploring yourself, because you're doing it in support of the change and like making yourself more comfortable and making yourself feel like you're more receptive to yourself. And it's not just like a punishment. Like I could imagine the couple, Jack and Jill, like being really upset with each other about the negativity and how they're affected by it, instead of like another person like Jack just looking at himself and saying like, hey, I just really want to get your feedback about like, these are the things I feel like I'm working on, And then the partner even saying like, well, these are the things I really like about you. And yeah, some of these things are really difficult because I know they're difficult for you, or, so it's such a different dialogue to be also just open around looking at yourself and allowing other people to look at you and give you feedback. There has to be some self-love that is developed in that to be able to do that, I think.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's, yeah, our self-love has been programmed out of us. And so only we can reprogram ourselves,
Right.
right? So like you're working with people, I'm working with people, but at the end of the day, we can lead them to water, but we can't make them drink. And so it's something that's innate in us that we've just lost contact with.
Right.
And when we came in as little kids, it was there. It just,
Right.
once the programming started, it started to shift.
Well, I mean, I think that's the reason why, like when you are doing in a couple, if you are a couple trying to seek some kind of therapy, maybe until the relationship is safe, because everyone's starting to do their work and look at themselves, that you find your places where you do the work that you feel safe until you can establish some kind of safety in your relationship to do the harder work. And I think that's also, I think one of the greatest things about doing energy work or therapy work, or just being with groups of people that are really interested in having deeper and healthier relationships, is like there's so much influence that everyone can have on each other. And that's why I love running my groups, is because I feel like there's this real healthy perspective that keeps growing, and then people really get lifted up by it, right? And sometimes when we're in relationships that are really struggling, we get pulled down by them, and we really have to keep trying to get into our own feelings of self-worth and value and self-love so that we can pull the relationship back up if it's been hit hard by whatever it is, COVID or some life stressor that was really intense.
Yeah. It's I like to describe the center of an onion is where the original event occurred. And then every time it gets reinforced, another layer of the onion wraps around all the way to you get this outer skin. And our exploration is into the center of the onion to find, to get to that sweet part. And it may, there may be tears, depending on what the event was. And that's why the gratitude list is the best way to start. To do the list of things I am grateful for about Cooper. I make my list of all the things I'm grateful for, and then I start to say these are the things that I'm uncomfortable with about Cooper, and I don't like to use terms that are judgmental. So uncomfortable or feel unhealthy is another. And if we have a sprained ankle, we have no qualms about working it and resolving it. Yet
right.
It's no different. It's just something that's unhealthy within our psyche,
Right.
that is addressable. And we're lucky enough to be living in an era where we can work it. We can understand it more than in the past.
Right. Right. So I'm really just appreciating the words that you've been able to give us today, some of the strategies that you've been able to outline here. And also just like the brilliance of the background. I think a cat just climbed over into the bushes there, and hearing the crows. And that just reminds me of there's so much out there to explore, right, in ourselves, and how we get help, and how we make connections with other people that are trying to work on themselves too, because there is a plethora of resources out there to get this information. So this is one opportunity we got, is to listen to how you're approaching it.
And make games of it, make it fun. Like we don't play enough.
Yeah, it doesn't, it's, I was talking to someone else yesterday about it. It's not like work on myself as much as it is like give myself permission to explore myself and find lots of ways to play with that.
Yeah. I love that. I was about to say explore, and you said it. Yeah. It's curiously explore. Just be like a little kid. Ooh, I didn't. So now I can be a little kid learning about myself.
Yeah.
And
Well, thank you so much, Cooper, for just giving us some words of wisdom there. And I'm sure we'll be talking again and sharing some more information with people as we start having more of these conversations ourselves.
yeah,
So
thank you.
thank you so much.
Have a blessed day.